to a teaching or discussing doing any kind of virtuous activity, then that enhances the benefit that we get from it. So we'll just take a moment to generate a positive motivation for continuing to discuss the concepts that Kuzho Lama introduced us to this morning. So just take a moment to cultivate that in your own mind. Out of my element because I don't have a whiteboard. What am I going to do? But let's see what we can do without a whiteboard. I like to draw pictures. I think it helps us to understand things if we can see a diagram or a picture of some of these things. Like, for instance, this morning, Kuzho Lama was using the word mind, and he was also using the word consciousness. Now, those two concepts, those two labels are describing very specific parts of mind. So the bigger category is consciousness. But included in that big category are different elements. So some of the elements include what we call primary minds or main minds. So like eye consciousness, that which allows us to see shapes and colors. Ear consciousness, that's what helps us to understand, that's what allows us to hear the traffic and everything else. Etc. So we have these 5 physical sense consciousnesses. That's how we know external objects. And then we also have a primary mental consciousness, and that's what allows us to understand concepts. In addition to that, he was talking about states of mind. Was that the term that Tsering was using? Or there are different ways we can talk about it. States of mind or mental factors. These are the things that influence how we see, how we hear, how we think about things. So, for instance, he used the example of anger. Anger is a mental factor. It's not a main mind. It's not a primary mind. It's a mental factor that when it's present, when it accompanies any of our main minds, it influences how we see. So, as he mentioned today, when there's anger in the mind, someone appears as an enemy. We think that the enemy comes from out there, like enemy exists from their own side because of something they're saying or doing. But this is exactly what Kuzho Lama is encouraging us to check out, to see, does it actually exist that way? Or are we confused about the basis? Are we confused about how things exist? And because of that confusion then, we create further negative states of mind, negative ways of thinking, and negative actions that accompany that. So for a lot of us who've heard some of these teachings before, this isn't new necessarily. But why is it so hard to do? When someone's criticizing you, the automatic response comes up. And that's why he said at the end, I think that's why he said at the end, this is why we need meditation. Because at least from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, meditation is specifically about familiarizing our minds with things that are true. And we have to familiarize and habituate so that that becomes our natural reaction. Right now, anger may be the uncontrived natural reaction to something that we view as harmful. Or attachment may be the automatic response to something that we think is going to bring us pleasure and happiness. But as we study, what we come to know more and more is that these things are distorting the way we're engaging with everything. Everything. Every relative phenomena, we're confused about how it exists, most of us. So, based on that, where should we start? Who's got a question?
Can you ever get, based on how you react to anger and our mind reacts, or that consciousness reacts, can you ever get rid of that seed, or will it always be there and can be ignited at any time?
There are different levels of purifying our minds of these distorted mental factors. So on the grossest level, we can try to understand, like he answered one question, we need to understand the nature of these mental factors. And as we do, as we come to understand the disadvantages that come from indulging in anger, this is something I often suggest people do. It's very powerful when you actually put it to paper. You know, you write out what happens physically when I get angry. Make an exhaustive list. You'll wonder, why am I continuing to do this? You know, what happens mentally when you get angry? What happens emotionally when you get angry? What happens in your relationships? What happens verbally when you get angry? So that's one level. When we come to understand more clearly how anger doesn't serve us, although it seems like it will, how it doesn't serve us, it brings suffering, that's one level that will help us to pull back from indulging in anger when it arises. Angry thoughts will still come up. We can't actually control them in our mind at this level, but we can begin to control our body and speech when anger arises. If we understand the disadvantages, we'll know we need to apply an antidote or do something different. So that's the grossest level. Then on a more subtle level, we can start working, or actually we could say that's even working at the nature of mind, understanding the nature of mind, then that becomes in a more subtle level. Then as you're describing, to get rid of the seeds, as long as there's a seed in our mind stream, some potential that's been left from previous angry actions or thoughts, we're vulnerable to that seed giving rise to another moment of anger. That's one of that's one of the ways they describe seeds. It can actually give rise to a moment of consciousness. It can influence the kind of consciousness we have. So to get rid of the seeds, that's why we need to understand ultimate truth. When we have a direct perception of the ultimate nature of reality, the absolute nature of reality, that's what begins abandoning those seeds completely so that they are removed. They can't give rise to anything because they're not there. So this is why it's important for us as people interested in these topics, not just to settle for, I mean, it's good, we need to be nice people. We need to develop love and kindness, compassion, things like that, but that by itself is not enough. And this is something that's unique to Buddhism, is that we're encouraged to actually begin to investigate, well, what is the ultimate nature of reality, of ourselves and of everything around us? And that's what can actually cut the seeds, abandon the seeds at the root so that they can never, if they're not there, they can't give rise to a suffering result. And not only the seed level, but also even the level of the imprint, which is what allows a mind to become enlightened, to be completely free of all obscurations whatsoever.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
Venerable, what is an imprint? Something just left in
Imprints,
mind?
yes. It's a different kind of potential. Imprints are different from seeds in that they can't give rise to similar states of mind. They don't give rise to mind. But what they do give rise to, first of all, they come from when we have grasping at inherent existence or true existence, when we have ignorance in our mind, the innate grasping at an inherent self or inherent anything that exists without depending. When we have that kind of ignorance in our mind, then it leaves both a seed and an imprint. So the seed is the more gross aspect of that potential, and that can be removed. That's removed first by these perceptual realizations of emptiness. But even once we've gotten rid of all the disturbing emotions and their seeds, there's still impressions or imprints on the mind that can still distort the way things appear to us. We may not believe that they exist that way, but things will still appear to exist from their own side or truly without depending on anything else. So to actually accomplish complete Buddhahood, or if we weren't using Buddhist jargon, what would we say? If you wanted to completely accomplish the full potential of your mind, then you need to get rid of both the seeds and the imprints. So usually how we talk about it in Buddhist circles is that when we remove the seeds and the disturbing emotions, then we've achieved liberation. Liberation from cyclic existence. But still, there are imprints on the mind that prevent a person from being completely enlightened. So, does that help? You know, the analogy that's typically given is that if you put garlic in a bag, if you take the garlic out, that's like the seed. You can take it, you can actually remove those, but still there's the smell. And it's like that. Imprints still influence our mind. They influence how things appear to us. So we need to get rid of those as well. Is that good?
Geshe said that consciousness cannot exist without an object.
Yes.
When he talks about knowledge being an object.
Objects of knowledge. Okay. When a person studies Dura, collected topics, one of the first topics that the monks and nuns are introduced to is how do things exist? And so if we talk about things that exist, there are different labels that we can give to those, like object, or object of knowledge, object of comprehension. What that means is it's something that can be known by mind. It's an existent, it's something that exists. So what he was saying is that there won't be a mind that comes into being if there's not an object to engage. If there's not an object to engage, there's no mind to. It's not like we just have mind without objects. Even if we're just sitting and thinking, there is a mental object. It's like a generic. We call it a generic image, a mental image. But typically, all day long, we're engaging external objects. Is that okay?
I was just wondering about in deeper states of meditation, on emptiness, for example, where there isn't a specific object.
Oh, there is, though. Why do you think there's no object? That's a good question. Like,
Doesn't matter.
fair enough. Me neither. Now they say, like for instance, if you're meditating on the empty nature of the self or the I, the person, then your object, your focal object, would be the conventional person, the person that conventionally exists. But what's appearing to the mind is emptiness. You know, the lack of. What you're looking for when you're doing meditation on emptiness is the inherently existent I. That's the I that doesn't exist. So, like you're saying, we're not finding, and it's the not finding that is actually the realization. But you do have an object. And that's what Kuzho Lama was describing at some point when he was talking about the flowers, that the flowers have two natures. They have a conventional nature, and that's what we engage with. We can know that with our senses. But the ultimate nature, or the absolute nature of the flower, or ourselves, or anything around us, is much more subtle. Those are things that we can't know with our senses. So we're going to have to use logic and reasoning to actually develop valid states of mind that understand that nature. And there's a whole process that one goes through. And I think that would be included in this Buddhist science or mind science that he's talking about. You know, that at first we might not even question how things exist. And that would just be wrong consciousness. We think erroneously about how things exist. But then we come to a teaching like this, and Kuzho Lama starts talking about things don't exist the way they appear, and then we develop a little bit of doubt. We start thinking, maybe things don't exist the way they appear. And then with more study, more familiarity with those concepts, eventually we'll develop a correct assumption where we can say, things don't exist the way they appear. We're still controlled by that. And that mind is still not a very stable mind. But eventually, through more and more familiarity, and that's the big if, isn't it humbling? How long it takes to get the mind to change. Through more and more familiarity, we can actually develop very valid, very stable minds that understand the nature of reality, still at the conceptual level. And then again, more and more familiarity, more meditation, eventually we can have a perceptual realization of the ultimate nature, the absolute nature of how things exist. This is our job description. Our long-term goal. Yes?
I've heard the phrase that, Nari being in meditative equipoise on emptiness, that no phenomena would appear to the mind.
what was the last part?
That no phenomena would actually appear to the
No
mind.
relative phenomena appear to the mind.
Yeah, and just thinking now, relative, known relative phenomena, but the ultimate nature of the phenomena would. So there would still be a focal object.
Well, the focal object and the appearing, the focal object and the object that you're engaging are going to be different things. So you're still focusing, that Arya being is still focusing on the conventional nature of the self, the body and the mind, or, the conventional self. That which is imputed on a constantly changing body and mind. But in deep meditation, what's actually appearing to the mind is the ultimate or the absolute nature of that entity. It's just like, something that we can relate to better, since I'm not an Arya being, are you? Is that when we're angry or when we're attached to something or someone, let's put it that way, then that person or that thing appears, it exists in one way, right? And that's what we're trying to understand here. How do persons exist? How do things exist? So it exists like it's dependent, it's constantly changing, it's impermanent, it's got flaws as well as good qualities. That's the reality of the situation. But when we're strongly attached to something, how does it appear to the mind? So two things are happening. We're actually engaging something that exists, but because of the distortion of the mental factors, it appears in a way that doesn't accord with reality. So, in a similar way, because all relative phenomena are deceptive, or what was it, Tsering, what was that definition she used? Completely false. In other words, it's not the ultimate or the final nature, the absolute nature of it. It appears in a false way. So we're trying to close the gap between what we're actually engaging and how it really exists, whether that's on a relative or an ultimate level, and how we think it exists. Yeah. So we can start by working on the relative level, and eventually, over time, build up enough strength of mind that we can engage things on an ultimate level. We can understand a lot at the relative level. Like, for instance, what he was talking about, anger. It seems as if the person is harming us, and as if that person is under their own control, like they're intentionally harming us, right? But doesn't it do something a little different to the heart when you think, no, that's not true. That person is temporarily controlled by some other mental factor, and that's what's making them say these things to me, or that's what's making them do something that I find, difficult. So if we really familiarize ourselves with that concept, our lives would be completely different. Tough job. But not impossible. It really just requires familiarity. I give this story often because it brings the point home. Kuzho Lama asked us one time, why is it that you get angry when someone criticizes you? Immediately it's like this volcano comes up. Why isn't our first reaction not something more along the lines of, wow, that person's suffering. I wonder how I can help them. That could just as easily be our initial, our spontaneous response to something. It's just simply due to lack of familiarity. That's what he said. It's just due to habit that we see things in one way and not another. And it's not just habit from this lifetime. It's habit from beginningless lifetimes. That's another thing we talk about from a Buddhist point of view anyway, is that the mind stream, mind is not some physical thing. It's a non-physical continuum of individual moments. One moment of eye consciousness, one moment of ear consciousness, one moment of mental consciousness. And they're linked together, and they happen so fast that we imagine, this is another erroneous thought, we imagine that there's something solid or fixed there. That's probably the I, maybe we could call that ego, that part, that erroneous mind that thinks there's something solid or fixed there.
Kuzho Lama was talking about the flower. I wrote something down and then crossed it out, so I'm still not too sure. So the ultimate nature is the flower's lack of inherited existence.
Yes.
Reality, we see the flower. So relative truth, is that the flower? And where do when you break it down and say the flower is just made up of causes and conditions, you know, the sun, the sand, the soil, the parts of the flower, is that part of the relative truth, or is that when you're breaking down relative truth, trying to understand what ultimate truth is?
That kind of analysis that you're describing can help us to get to understand, or be able to understand the ultimate nature of the flower. The fact that the flower exists independent upon these things is describing relative truth. So the two natures are interrelated. If we really understand one well, and that's what Kuzho Lama is suggesting to us, if we really understand well how things exist, naturally, as a byproduct, we'll begin to understand it can exist in this other way. Because what we find is that if something is dependent, well, it can't be independent. And that's really what we're talking about when we say something is inherent, or something exists from its own side, or something exists by way of its own characteristic. Or something exists truly. Those are different phrases that we can use for an erroneous way of assuming how something exists. So if we understand that something exists in a dependent way, then that, if we understand that ultimate truth is the opposite of that, or no, if we understand dependent arising, we'll naturally understand the lack of something existing independently.
So therefore, still when you break it down, that's still seeing it as relative.
If we're understanding something being dependent,
Yeah.
then we're talking at the relative level. But we need to use those, like I said, we have to get to this understanding of ultimate truth through logic and reasoning. So we need to use this logic and reasoning to begin to understand how it is things do and don't exist.
So if we don't see it as the relative truth, we can't possibly understand the ultimate.
Yeah. So we begin in stages, and like you described, the first stage, or maybe the grossest type of depending, is through causes and conditions. And Kuzho Lama has said in the past that just by understanding that level alone is not enough to help us generate a valid understanding of emptiness, but it's a good start. And it's a level that we, as ordinary beings, can really relate to. We can understand cause and effect because we can see it in our external world. We can know it from our own experience. But then to take it to the next level and try to understand that independent upon parts, there is something, like whatever it is, something comes into being independence upon its parts. That's a little more subtle. It requires a little more understanding. And then at the most subtle level, we understand that we've completely imputed an object there, independence upon a basis of designation, that even if we were to investigate that, none of those bases exist the way they appear to either. So it becomes this infinite regress of looking for where is the thing that actually exists there. And that's the most subtle level of
So they're not two separate things. They're two, the relative and the ultimate. And they're not two separate. They're on a sliding scale.
well, each phenomena, each object, each existent thing has both natures. One can be known through a distorted mind. One can be known through a completely accurate mind. So when we talk about relative truths, these are things that appear true to a mind that's still influenced by ignorance. Because when we talk about relative, the relative of relative truth is really talking about from the point of view of a mind grasping at inherent existence, a mind that is controlled by ignorance, innate ignorance that grasps at inherent existence. When we talk about ultimate truth, we're actually talking about the Arya's meditative equipoise, single-pointedly focused on the ultimate nature, the empty nature of that phenomenon, on the one object. I was going to say it's like two sides of the coin, but it's not. It's like one side of the coin. Just depends.
So it's actually more on the sliding scale because you can't have,
No.
if you have one, you can't have the other. If you have one, you can't have the other. If
Well-
you see it ultimately, you won't see it relatively. If you see it relatively, you're not seeing it ultimately.
Well, that's an interesting point. Buddhas can see both.
Okay.
Ordinary beings, and even Arya sentient beings can't see both at the same time. And that's the point we were talking about earlier, is that when someone is in meditative equipoise and they're having a perceptual realization of the empty nature of an object, the only thing that appears to them is that object's lack of inherent existence. It's a negation, it's not a thing. And this is something that takes a little bit of thinking about to begin to understand. But even that negation is an object that can be known to the mind. Yeah. Ben?
When I'm looking at this room, is there something, is it this happening out there or in my mind or a combination of both? What would be the perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, just because we talk about minds being non-material, it doesn't mean that we also don't depend on eyes that function in the way that modern science tells us how eyes function. Eyes do function because of, and I haven't studied eyes, so I don't really know all the jargon. Maybe some of you are medical people and you know this better than I do. You know, there's light coming in and there's refraction and I don't know how the eye works. That still is valid. But in addition to that, that's still talking about the physical components of the eye. That's a basis that will support, it'll be one of the bases that support eye consciousness. So while we still depend on light and the retina and all the parts of the eye, and even what they call the eye sense faculty, a very subtle type of eye, that's one of the conditions. You know, you talked about those three conditions that need to be present for a new consciousness. One is the focal object, and for most, you know, we'll talk about that as an external thing, a form. Then there's what he called the cooperative condition. Another way of talking about that, and maybe you're familiar with these terms, is the empowering condition or the governing condition. That's that subtle type of eye, that subtle matter in the eye that actually is what's considered the support for the eye consciousness. And then there's what he called the substantial cause, which is the immediately preceding condition of consciousness. So consciousness, one moment of consciousness comes from a previous moment of consciousness. But what it's able to do depends on the faculty that it's moving through. You know, like, I've wondered sometimes if we could think about mind in terms of just this stream of knowing. And it gets pressed out through our organs, you know? So if it comes through the eyes, then for us ordinary beings, then we can only understand forms if we're depending on the uncommon empowering condition of the eye sense faculty. It's still mind, you know, it's still something that knows. And if it were to be squished out through the ear, as it were, you know, then we'd engage a sound. So, how do we know things? In addition to those three features, also what's carried along on our mind stream is karma, karmic seeds, these seeds and imprints that we were talking about. So the fascinating thing, the sobering thing, is to understand that how something appears to us is principally due to our karma. If something appears attractive, it's due to our karma. If something appears unattractive, it's principally due to our karma. So this is another reason that we say that how things appear to us depends on mind and the activities the mind has been doing in the past, which has left these potentials on the mind. But we're convinced in the moment that that object actually exists, you know, out there in the way I see it. Not understanding that we've got very thick glasses on that predispose how we see things. And that's why everyone in this room will view Kuzho Lama or the flower or whatever the object might be in a slightly different way. Some people may not like flowers. Some people may not like that color. Some people might be quite attracted to those flowers. You know, we have to talk about it in those terms to begin to understand it. That's why he said friend and enemy come from the mind. Sure doesn't seem that way in the moment. You know, why is it we have preference for some people and not others? We think it comes from them, from the way they act. But maybe some of that comes from the side of the object, or the way the person interacts with our karmic seeds, and then we begin seeing in certain ways. it's very complex. We try to break it down into simple terms to begin to understand it, but actually there's a lot going on anytime we're seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting, even thinking. Any further questions on that?
Going back to the latest question about can you understand relativity, the relative mind and ultimate mind, I use experience as senses because we're fixed with our senses until we understand our senses completely. We let go of our senses, we'll never understand ultimate mind because we're in this physical form, this human being, this life. Until we get the knowledge, we need to know that our senses, because we're so fixed with eye senses, ear senses, and mental, they control us. Not to know the ultimate mind.
Well, actually, Lama made the distinction that it's the mental factors that control us, not the mind.
True, but our senses of this physical form is questionable. That's why we can't see the ultimate mind at any stage. While we've got these senses that we're controlled by.
Do you think we'll let go of our senses?
Well, we can when we have the ultimate knowledge, which is emptiness.
So a Buddha doesn't have senses? Does a Buddha have eye consciousness?
Hang on, which what are we talking about?
Well, any Buddha.
Well, it depends. Like I've taken the Dalai Lama, a living Buddha, yes, you're correct. If I took Shakyamuni Buddha, I'd say no, because he was an emanation of emptiness.
Emanations don't have consciousnesses?
They have consciousness, but
Okay.
they allow the uncontrolled. They're not controlled by the eye sense, the ear sense, the nose sense, and the taste senses.
Okay, let's make a distinction. The eye consciousness, actually this is a good thing to talk about. The main minds or the primary minds, or we could talk, primary consciousness. So we have to be very clear about these words that we're using. Consciousness is like the big category. So we need to talk about primary consciousnesses. And those primary consciousnesses, like eye consciousness, that just engages the object as it is. It just knows shape and color. It doesn't have any preference. It doesn't have any distortion on its own. It just knows the bare object. So what is it then that comes in and brings that distortion is this second category of mental factors or states of mind. And that's the distinction Kuzho Lama was making, that these are the things that we can influence. We need to identify the errors, the erroneous mental factors, come to understand their nature, and then eliminate them by applying the antidotes. So like we were talking earlier, there are different levels that you can begin to apply antidotes. First, just at the level of speech and action, but then at the level of mind, actually understanding the nature of those mental factors, understanding how they're distorted, that they bring negative results, and then ultimately at the level of removing them at the level of the seeds. So actually he was making a very clear distinction that it's at the level of the mental factors. It's the mental factors that are controlling us, whether positive or negative. So what we're trying to do is understand that this is the nature of the mind so that we can improve or cultivate positive states of mind. Positive why? Why would they be positive? You know, did Buddha just arbitrarily put some in a positive category and some in a negative category? Actually, the positive states of mind accord with reality. And the negative states of mind have some kind of distortion to them. So what we're trying to do is identify the ones with distortions, the ones that actually cause us to see things erroneously, mistakenly, and remove those. And also to cultivate the positive ones. And that's why he said when he was talking to the woman about love, you know, he said, well, the difference between love and attachment, we have to understand the nature of both of those terms. Like, what are we actually talking about? So attachment has some kind of distortion to it. It's exaggerating the positive qualities. Where love is, we're not talking about just some generic warm and fuzzy thing. We're actually talking about a mind that wishes for another person to have happiness. And understanding that it is the nature of all people or all beings with mind to bring that about. To actually, every person with mind has the potential to achieve lasting happiness. And so therefore that's a valid mind. You're wishing for this person. It may not come about very quickly, but we can develop that wish for another person. And so he made the distinction, if a child isn't doing what you want them to, then if you are really motivated purely by love, your love is only going to grow for that child. You understand that what they're doing is going to actually harm them. But if our love is mixed with attachment or dominated by attachment, then we'll actually get angry. We're more concerned about getting what we want rather than thinking about the welfare of the child. Anything else? Yeah.
Just a point of clarification, when Geshe said at the beginning that external phenomena can bring about happiness, he was talking about contaminated happiness. Is that how you read that, or was he, referencing in my knowledge that in external objects is the seed of its own destruction, and that's what brings, attachment arises mostly to the point of destruction, perhaps, or sometimes anyway. So, because I kind of contradicted a little bit what I thought of when considering external objects, that they can't bring you happiness.
Well, yeah. How I understood him to talk about that before is that those things act as conditions for us to experience happiness. They're not the substantial cause of our happiness. But let's face it, without food, we wouldn't be unless we've done a lot of work on our mind. There are people who can live without eating physical food. But for ordinary beings, if we didn't have food, if we didn't have shelter, if we didn't have adequate clothing to keep us warm or to keep us cool, then we would experience more suffering. But you're right, it will be, until we've removed the ignorance from our mind stream, those kinds of happinesses will be contaminated. And we can see that very easily. If we have too much of something, it very quickly reveals its nature, or reveals the nature of our mind, which is it's still contaminated. All of a sudden, we experience suffering from those things.
Are we using pleasure and happiness the same way?
Yeah, I think so.
I think the exterior thoughts of what we have, they bring a pleasure. I don't think actually brings happiness. Not the happiness we're looking for in life.
Right.
So to me, if I ask the question, I question the exterior mind, because it only brings pleasure, and pleasure can only bring suffering. That's why I ask the question. We're saying pleasure brings happiness.
Samsara pleasure is the daughter of suffering, is the line from the prayer. So, samsara pleasure is the daughter of suffering, is the line to the prayer, isn't it?
It's the suffering of change, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a type of suffering. Any other questions? Yeah.
When on Friday night, Wednesday night, sorry, visual night, we had suffering and change.
Yeah.
Is that also, like you're saying, it's just a lesser degree of suffering feels like it's happiness when it's actually just less suffering. But does it also mean like if I have happiness, something good happens, is the suffering change also that happiness won't last, it's only temporary? Is that a part of it as well? Or?
That's why it's called the suffering of change. It doesn't last, it's impermanent. It's still contaminated by ignorance, and therefore it's being contaminated happiness, it can't possibly last.
So even though it's sort of temporarily happiness, it will become suffering? Is that how it works?
Right. See, what we don't, and he described this very clearly on Wednesday night. I thought, he said, when we're standing up, and all of a sudden we experience the suffering of standing up, then we sit down and we think, oh, there's pleasure. But actually, we're getting the pleasure from not standing. We're removed from the suffering of standing. But what hasn't come to our attention yet is the suffering of sitting. And so at first, the suffering of sitting is actually quite minimal. But if we do it long enough, as you know, it begins to reveal itself. And this is true of everything, every contaminated thing that we engage. As long as our mind is contaminated, everything we engage will have this suffering nature. That's why, the way I like to think about it is that, or one way we can analyze this is there anything that we can experience that doesn't eventually reveal its suffering nature to us? And if of the things that we enjoy, does everybody enjoy them the same way that we do? And does it always bring us the same kind of pleasure? Or is it possible that if we were in a bad mood, even that thing that we enjoy, maybe it's our favorite CD, if we're in a bad mood or we're sad maybe, if we've lost a loved one, all of a sudden the things that we rely on to bring us happiness don't bring us the same kind of happiness. That's a clue that things don't exist the way they appear to. And this is a very inconvenient truth. Don't you hate it? It just wrecks everything, because I would venture to say that all of us are looking for happiness in external things, aren't we? It's a strong habit. So only until we begin investigating, does this exist the way I think it does, can we begin to extract ourselves from that kind of erroneous grasping. I mean, it doesn't have to, it's not like a physical grasping, but it's funny when you say grasping, the hand just actually goes like that. It's the way our mind is holding an object. So we need to understand that our mind is, how our mind functions. Our mind is holding objects to exist in certain ways. Our minds are holding our partners to exist in a certain way. Our minds are holding our children to exist in a certain way. Our minds are holding ourselves to exist in a certain way. And when we're shocked that they don't exist that way, that's a clue. That's like a wake-up call. And this is another reason that we're encouraged to meditate on death and impermanence, to really understand this is the nature of how we exist. If we face into the reality of that, then we'll be prepared when that eventuality occurs to us, or people that we love, rather than being shocked and surprised. One more?
So within that, it's not just that happiness is declining, it's actually happiness is being, like it's manifesting as suffering. It's not just like suffering changes, isn't just that you're happy and then it's a little bit less happy. It's like it actually becomes suffering. Is that sort of the gist of it?
Well, we label it happiness, but actually if we were to look into the nature of it, what we find is that it's actually suffering. It's just very different levels or degrees or awareness, we could say, awareness of the suffering. Like, for instance, when you sit down after standing, there is suffering there in that first moment of sitting down. This is what we don't understand, because it seems like it's pleasurable. But there's actually suffering there in that moment, and it reveals itself over more and more contact with that object, or with that activity of sitting. It's tricky.
That has the potential for suffering, or what appears as you have that relief when you sit down immediately.
Right.
It's relief as a first suffering.
Yes,
But starting the process of the second suffering.
that's right. That's exactly right.
Appears as the reality.
Well, it is a relief from the previous suffering, no doubt about it. But we forget to see that it's also the beginning of the next suffering. And so we impute pleasure. We label that pleasure, and then we cling to that as if it's pleasure, and then we're disappointed when it becomes suffering. But that disappointment comes from our own misunderstanding that even in that first moment there was suffering.
So it beggars the question, is there actually a ultimate level which we all want to achieve some kind or another? There is no such thing as pleasure.
There's contaminated pleasure. We've all experienced it.
But is that pleasure the beginning of the next suffering?
Well, it's merely labeled pleasure, isn't it? It's not pleasure that exists from its own side, and that's where we get fooled. It's dependent pleasure. Yeah, but it's also suffering, isn't it?
Thinking about all this makes me think of we're constantly talking about labeling everything.
Yeah.
That even the suffering itself is only a label in that way. So what we think is happiness or what is suffering, maybe it's not so we're thinking that fundamentally everything is only an experience on a base level, and it is that concept made out of it, making the suffering.
ultimately what you're saying is true.
Of course, you know, that suffering may be an unpleasant experience in one way. You know,
Yeah.
that is probably what makes us delay and like that. But
Suffering is just individual moments of sensation that we don't want.
that's right, yeah.
That's
But
right.
it's that concept, that's a concept in itself, isn't it, which is built from the structure of that which we have got as a karmic experience, or that what we've got as a concept.
Well, no, unpleasant sensation is not just a concept. You know, you're experiencing that with the primary tactile consciousness, so touch consciousness.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just
it's
found
not a
it
concept.
a bit, how do you say, a little bit dark, you know, to say that, oh, well, it's, of course, you know, all the pleasure we have got, it kind of ends up being suffering because we are, or, you know, we experience change. But I wouldn't say that every suffering basically is already, every happiness is already suffering again.
That's fine, we can say whatever we
I think
like.
that the suffering in
looking at it.
itself comes from the attitude they've got, you know, towards, you know, the happiness.
Well,
It comes
exactly.
from the clinging, and it comes from
Yeah.
the grasping, it comes from the
Exactly.
affection.
I think that's the point
So
Kuzho
the-
Lama's making. It's coming from the
Well, you know,
mind.
the banks are kind of started to sound like this, and I was like, oh, well, there's no happiness now because it's all suffering again, you know, so what the fuck, you know. I think that maybe I'm looking at it a little bit more like, you know. So,
I'm just aware that it's past 2 o'clock, so we can continue discussing this. Tomorrow morning at 9, we'll have another chance to do some discussion, and if you have questions, please think about what he said today. Really think it through in your own experience, and see what makes sense, see what doesn't make sense, and then let's come back and discuss it a little bit more tomorrow. Okay? So we'll stop here, and Kuzho Lama will start again at 2:30.